I want to show you 5 words that I think explain burnout in the yoga context, written somewhere about 2000 years ago. In the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras, Maharishi Patanjali describes what he calls the Kleshas, usually translated as afflictions or root causes of suffering. There are 5 of them: avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, and abhinivesha. Ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and fear of loss. Fear of death in its most literal translation, but with implications that go much further. When I first studied these in depth, I remember thinking, this is burnout. Today, I want to walk you through all 5 because I think understanding them will change how you think about why you burn out and, most importantly, what to do about it. Most discussions on burnout focus on workload, hours, boundaries, the external conditions that produce exhaustion. And those things matter, but I think they are often downstream of something else, something that operates underneath the workload, underneath the hours, underneath the boundaries that don't get held. The glaciers describe that underneath. They're not about what's happening to you, they're about the patterns in the mind that determine how what's happening to you gets experienced, and particularly why certain patterns lead to depletion almost regardless of the external circumstances. Each glacier on its own illuminates something, but together they form like a complete picture of why a person burns out, even when, especially when, from the outside everything looks fine. The first glacier is avidya, translated as ignorance, but not in a sense of lacking information. It's something closer to misapprehension about the real sense of things, seeing things as other than what they are, in which the other 4 glaciers grow. They are the variation of avidya. Swami Aranya's commentary describes avidya specifically as mistaking the impermanent for permanent, the impure for pure, painful for pleasure, and, which is the one I want to focus on, the non self for the self. In the context of burnout, I think this last one is the key. Avidya in burnout often looks like mistaking what you do for who you are. Your role, your output, your usefulness to others, your identity as the person who copes, who manages, who holds things together. None of these are you. These are the things you do, the roles you occupy, the patterns you've developed. But avidya is the misperception that collapses the distinction. That makes I am exhausted from this role feel identical to I am failing as a person. This misperception is exhausting because it means there is no version of slowing down or stopping or doing less that doesn't feel like an existential threat. If what you do is who you are, then doing less is being less. The second clash is asmita, often translated as ego or I-ness. It is closely related to avidya, but more specifically, it is the identification of the true self, the witness, with the instrument of cognition, the mind, the body, the roles, and the personality. In burnout, asmita often shows up as a particular kind of performance, not necessarily performing for others, though that also, but performing for yourself. An internal sense that you have to be a certain way, capable, composed, a person who has it all together, who others can rely on, and who doesn't need help. This performance is costly. Every moment spent maintaining an identity rather than simply being requires energy. And when that identity is the person who copes, the costs compound. Because coping itself becomes a performance on top of whatever is actually being coped with. Swami Aranya's commentary describes asmita as a fundamental confusion about what the self actually is. And I think one of the quiet tragedies of burnout is it is often the most capable, most reliable people who experience this most acutely. Because their asmita, their sense of who I am, has become most thoroughly fused with being the capable one. And capability sustained without rest is precisely what burns out. The third klesha is raga, attachment, which arises from remembrance of pleasure. The pull towards repeating an experience that felt good. In burnout, raga looks like attachment to the feeling of being needed, of being productive, of the particular satisfaction that comes from crossing things off a list, from being the one who handles it, from the small hit of validation that comes with each completed task. This isn't a moral failing. The brain's reward system responds to these things. Productivity genuinely does feel good in the moment. But Raga describes what happens when the pull becomes a grip, when you can't not respond to the next task, the next request, the next thing that needs handling. Because some part of you is chasing the feeling that comes from handling it. The exhausting thing about rag in burnout is that it doesn't feel like exhaustion from the inside, at least not at first. It feels like motivation, like a drive. It's only later when the body finally insists on rest, often through illness or collapse, that cost becomes visible. The fourth clash is dvesh, aversion. The pull away from experiences that have caused pain or that we anticipate will cause pain. In burnout, dvesh often shows up as aversion to rest itself. That sounds paradoxical. Surely, an exhausted person would want rest. But for many people heading towards or already in burnout, rest becomes associated with discomfort, with the anxious thoughts that arise when there's nothing to do, with the guilt of not being productive, with facing feelings that have been successfully outrun through busyness. So there's a pull away from stopping, not because stopping isn't needed, but because stopping has become its own source of discomfort. The person caught in this pattern keeps moving in parts to avoid what arises when they don't. Dvesha also shows up as aversion to asking for help, to admitting difficulty to anything that might be experienced, even just by oneself, as weakness or failure. The fifth clash, abhinivesha, translated as fear of death or clinging to life. But Swami Aranya's commentary makes it clear that this isn't only about literal mortality. It describes as a kind of fundamental, almost unconscious fear of cessation, of things stopping, of not continuing as they have been. In burnout, I think abhinivesha is often the deepest layer and the hardest to see. It can show up as, if I stop, what happens? If I'm not the one holding this together, does it fall apart? If I'm not productive, useful, needed, who am I? This isn't usually a conscious thought. It's more like a background hum, a low level anxiety about what would happen if the current pattern stopped. And because that anxiety is uncomfortable to look at directly, it's often easier to just keep going, to not find out what happens if you stop by never stopping. Here's what I find remarkable about this framework. Avidya, mistaking your role for your identity, creates the condition. Asmita, the performed self, maintains them. Raga, attachment to the feeling of being needed, pulls you forward. Dvesha, aversion to rest and to admitting difficulty, pushes you away from the exit. And abhinivesh, the fear of what stopping would mean, keeps the whole structure in place, often invisibly. This isn't a framework about willpower or time management or boundaries, though those things can help. It's a framework about the patterns of mind that make burnout almost inevitable for certain people in certain roles, regardless how well they manage their calendar. And I think there's something genuinely freeing about seeing it this way. Because if the burnout was simply about not managing your time well enough, the solution would be manage your time better. But if the burnout is about these five patterns, about a fundamental relationship with identity, performance, attachment, aversion, and fear, then the path through is different. It's not about doing more efficiently, it's about seeing these patterns clearly enough that they lose their grip, even slightly. Here's a practice for this week, a noticing, not a fix. Over the next few days, see if you can catch any of these five patterns as they arise. You don't have to do anything about them yet. Just notice. Avidya, a moment where doing less felt like being less. Where I need a break immediately translated in your mind to I'm failing. Asmita, a moment where you performed capability or capacity even when nobody was watching. When you held something together that you didn't have to hold just because that's who you are. Raga, a moment you said yes to something not because you had capacity, but because some part of you wanted the feeling of being the one who said yes. Dvesha, a moment where stopping felt worse than continuing, where rest brought up something uncomfortable and continuing felt easier than facing it. Abhinivesh, a moment where you noticed, even briefly, a kind of anxiety about what would happen if you weren't holding everything together. A flicker of if I stop, what happens? That noticing, the willingness to turn towards the pattern rather than keep moving, that's yield. And giving it a name. This is asmita. This is dvesh. That's understand. You can't walk with what you're unwilling to see. The Kleshas don't ask you to be different. They ask you to look. On Saturday, I've built a yoga practice that works with these patterns in the body through movement and stillness so that you can begin to feel where each of these glaciers might be living physically, not just conceptually. If you recognized yourself in any of this today, that recognition is the beginning of something, the beginning of a different relationship with the patterns that have been running almost invisibly for a very long time. Maharishi Patanjali believed these patterns could be seen clearly, and that seeing them clearly was itself the path towards something more settled. I'll see you Saturday.